While I have the floor, I'll just mention that this is the last of these lunchtime seminars during the board meetings at which our distinguished Director General Joachim von Braun will be present. But we've been saying during our board meeting during the morning that IFPRI's come a very long way, gone from strength to strength as with Joachim as Director General. We're sorry to see him go, but very grateful for your achievements in building the institution while you're here, Joachim, and we're also confident that with Schengen Fan having been appointed as Director General, will continue to go from strength to strength. I'm going to say some general things about the crisis, and we'll get more deeply into specifics later on. But what we went through late in 2008 was of truly historic proportions. It took a lot of us by surprise. It took me by surprise more than most, because for the 18 months leading up to September the 30th, I'd been deeply immersed in preparing a report on climate change for our Prime Minister, and I presented it to him in front of all the Australian media on September the 30th, 2008. Well, the night before was the day before US time, but the night before our time had the biggest one-day fall on the New York Stock Exchange in numbers of points ever, because the Congress had just rejected President Bush's rescue package. And so I'd been thinking of nothing but climate change for 18 months, and the press all wanted to ask me about the significance of what had happened the night before in New York. I had to stay deeply immersed in climate change for a couple of months more, but from the beginning of this year, I had to catch up very quickly on this financial crisis. International finance, international economics is one of my main areas of specialism, and I'd written the first book to come out after the Asian financial crisis. And as I read into it, I thought that to help me understand it, I needed to write something substantial, and so we have the great crash of 2008. The crash came at the end of what, apart from its unsustainable character, was a wonderful period of economic expansion in the world economy in the early 21st century, really dating from the time of the tech wreck crash in the United States in 2000. After that, recovery from that gave way to very broadly based economic growth through the world economy, reaching some of the strongest rates of growth in the world as a whole that the world had ever seen, over 5% in 2006 and 2007. These are the sorts of rates you had at the peak of the post-war golden age in the 50s and 60s. But importantly, it was very broadly based growth. The heart of the growth was in developing countries. And there are spectacular stories that we're all familiar with, the very strong growth in China in this period. This was the period where India became more confident about growth, and average growth rates rose year by year through this time. Southeast Asia was at first recovering from its own Asian financial crisis, but then going strongly. And most wonderfully of all, as we'll learn a bit more from Usman, in Africa, average rates of growth became very much stronger, averaging through sub-Saharan Africa, I think, over 5% through those years. So it was very broadly based global growth, much more broadly based than the golden age of the 50s and 60s. There is one interpretation of the crash that says that after a period of exceptionally strong economic growth, you're going to get imbalances that give rise to a crash, to recession. But there were many aspects of this increase in rates of growth in developing countries that were not unsustainable. I won't go into that now, but there was a firm basis, a firm foundation based on better policies, learning the lessons of the past, driving growth in the big Asian developing countries, China, India, Indonesia, but also Africa and to some extent Latin America. There were some large imbalances that emerged from the growth itself, and especially payments imbalances between North America, well, the United States in particular, but other English-speaking countries as well, including my own, and the big Asian developing countries. A symbiosis developed of policies that otherwise couldn't have been sustained even for a short time, being followed in the United States and some other English-speaking countries and Spain, and this suited an export-oriented strategy in parts of East Asia and later on in India. And some people say that these imbalances played a role in the Great Crash, but there were other things happening that causally were crucial to the crash that happened. The emergence of unusual derivatives, not properly understood, encouraging risk in financial institutions on a scale the world has never seen before, and also some changes in behaviour of actors in financial markets, some constraints on moral behaviour that led leaders of institutions to take risks with their institution stability that would have been restricted more by internal moral restraints earlier in history. It was all of these things coming together: the rise in asset values from a long boom, the big imbalances, the changes in constraints on moral behaviour, and the new instruments on a gigantic scale that I call clever money in the book. And it took the combination of all of these things to bring the boom in asset prices down suddenly with a crash in September last year. And when it came down, it was a huge crash. It is the first big global financial crisis of the era of globalization, but it was big on any historical scale. It was the biggest of the financial crisis the world has ever seen, and the immediate economic impact was immense. The decline in trade in the 9 months after September last year was greater than in the first 21 months of the Great Depression. And this had a huge sudden effect on every economy in the world. The impact was greatest first on the export-oriented economies, the most export-oriented, and these were first of all the East Asians. And so dramatically in China, where 140 million people had moved from the countryside to the industrial cities, many of them employed in labour-intensive export industries, suddenly there were no new orders. And within a very short period of time, a couple of months, 70 million of those people had been laid off and were going back to the countryside. The biggest human migration in history had gone into reverse. This happened on a smaller scale everywhere. The first half of last year was the period of the very high food prices and the anxieties about the impact of that on hunger and poverty that we were studying and analysing. Well, one impact of the crash was that it put a bit of a damper on commodity prices, including food prices, even more dramatically other commodity prices. Unlike the Great Depression, there was a huge, quick fiscal and monetary expansion. We'd learned some lessons from the Great Depression right through the developed countries, but in many developing countries as well, including the the big Asian developing countries. The biggest expansion in the world, monetary and fiscal together, was in China. And we can now see that this combined concerted expansion had a very big impact and meant that we did not get a continued spiraling down in economic activity. This is the big difference between this crash and the Great Depression. It was in the big developing countries, it was domestic demand expansion that was substituted for export demand. Export demand didn't pick up very strongly, but in China in particular, and China's been at the center of the world recovery, you had huge increases in domestic investment compensating for the loss of export revenue, so that by the middle of 2009, China was back on a strong growth path. And one of the, now as we look at the aftermath of the crash, we see a quite differentiated effect on different countries. The countries that are struggling, and they'll struggle for a long time, are the developed countries whose financial institutions were in the most trouble. United States and a number of countries in Europe. Interestingly, and a little bit surprisingly, the big Asian developing countries, linked so much to foreign trade, have come through, after a brief big impact, come through rather well. And in the three most populous developing countries, India, China, Indonesia, there's been very little departure from the long-term strong rates of growth. But then there's poorer developing countries, and this is where the difficult legacy is going to be. The immediate impact of a collapse of modern finance and trade is not so large in a poor country that's not closely linked to world markets, but those countries are very dependent on drawing on aid, and the trade that they do have with the West is of great value to their development, and so the long-term impact is going to be most difficult for the poor developing countries. One legacy of the crash is that there's a big shift in the relative weight of different economies. The developed countries of the North Atlantic will have less capacity for global leadership, and the supply of international public goods, including the ones we're most concerned about, aid, support for agricultural research in developing countries, which once depended so much on the developed countries of the West, will now be under much more pressure. And the supply of international public goods is going to require a joining of the large and successful developing countries in global leadership. And that's, I think, going to be one of the big legacies of the crash. Thank you.